Two friends,
Two pastors,
two theologians,
exploring God and the greatest mysteries of life.
unscripted,
I'm Dr. Wes Arblaster,
and I'm Dr. Ethan Smith.
and we are...
Mysterion. If you got a case of the Mondays, start over.
This is a case of the Mondays. Look at you, man. Let's do it again.
I'm leaving that right there. Keep it going.
Keep it going, man.
Today on Mysterion, Wes and I fight the Noonday demon.
The Noonday demon, the ancient demon of the Mondays. And it is Monday.
And Ethan has
It is
to be
Monday.
some-
And Ethan's got a cold, and he's not feeling so hot, and it's a rough week.
So
man.
send money. That would make me feel better. Send money.
So yeah, actually, we're getting into some pretty heavy stuff today. The Noonday
The
demon.
Noonday
The
demon.
Noonday demon. Yeah. We're talking about Acedia. Now, that's a weird word.
Acedia.
Yes. This is the demon that Evagrius says is pretty much, he says it's the most burdensome and impressive.
Mm-hmm.
So,
It's bad. Like
yeah,
a demon.
It's really bad. So, last week we talked about sadness, right? We talked about sadness. And then from that point on, Evagrius goes into anger. But we already touched on anger. We did that in the episode called Mysterion Gets Grilled or something like that.
Yeah.
Is that right? With Martin, we talked about anger. So he went from sadness to a passion that's more dangerous, which is anger, and then we taking another step in severity to something he says is even more dangerous.
Calls it the
burdensome.
most oppressive.
The most oppressive.
passion. So what is acedia, Wes?
What is acedia? So again, acedia is a word that we don't use today. There's not really a good English equivalent for it. It's got dimensions of depression or despondency to it. Another word that's often used is like listlessness or restlessness. There's also a sense of how do I say, apathy.
Apathy, kind of a frustrated apathy, right? Not
frustrated
just an I
apathy.
don't care, but someone who's in such a frustrated state that they just kind of give up on it, right?
So there's no real good word for it in English, but what we can find by going back and actually reading the description that Evagrius gives us, we actually get a pretty vivid picture of what acedia is, especially in his context in his life, but it definitely something that resonates with us today. Because as we read it, what we're going to find is, oh my gosh, this is something, we never had a name for it, but it's something that we experience all the time. And it's something that seems to me is becoming more and more prevalent as time goes on.
Because we'll see, like distractions, like giving into every little pleasure you can give into is one of the ways we run headlong into this passion.
Yeah.
We fall victim to it, and it's very particular kind of misery.
Yes.
It sneaks up on you, but then it's just terrible.
It is terrible, and it's long-lasting, and it's complicated, and it's kind of like a quagmire, honestly.
Yeah.
Just before we dive into Evagrius and get that vivid description, I just want to again paint the picture here. The passions are what pulls us away from the peace of Christ, which Evagrius says is this word dispassion, this kind of stillness, this peace that produces love. So acedia is going to be one of these things that really draws us away from that peace and that stillness, that kind of rest in Christ that allows us to love the Lord and one another fully.
So to go back to how we started the season, like for a good picture of dispassion or stillness in Christ, again, think of Christ getting done with his prayers in the Garden of Gethsemane. And from there till his death on the cross, all these terrible things happen, but he's utterly still through those things. Doesn't even make arguments to defend himself. He just continues to bless, and he's calm. And so it was his capacity to love, even through being betrayed, being falsely accused, being beaten, being crucified. That capacity to love was born of that stillness, which is what we're trying to get to. And the passions are those things that stir us up in a way that we're incapable of that kind of love that can push through trouble.
That's right. That's right. So here we go. We're going to dive right in. This is section 12 of the Practicus, where Evagrius talks about the demon of Acedia. He says, the demon of Acedia, also called the Noonday demon. There it is, the Noonday demon. This is actually a reference to Psalm 91, or in the Septuagint or the Orthodox scriptures, it would be Psalm 90. But this is also called the Noonday demon. We'll get into that in a moment. But and it is one that causes the most serious trouble of all.
Wait,
Go
this is
ahead.
like the demon that makes me want to go to Taco Bell,
Yeah.
right? At noon every day. Sorry, I've had a lot of medicine.
All right. He causes the most trouble of all. He presses his attack upon the monk about the 4th hour and besieges the soul until the 8th hour. Now, in our sort of time, our clock, our 12-hour clock, this is pretty much from about 10 in the morning till about 2 in the afternoon. So it's right around noon. That's why it's called the Noonday demon. Okay, and we'll get into why that is the case. But let's first of all figure out what this Noonday demon does. First of all, he makes it seem that the sun barely moves, if at all, and that the day is 50 hours long. So now I want you to think about this. We can kind of think about this in the context of Evagrius' time. Evagrius they're living out in the desert. They have these solitude these places where they live on their own. And during the morning, they wake up and they have sort of a daily rhythm. Mm-hmm. You begin with your morning prayers.
And it's nice and cool.
It's nice and cool in the day. It's a pleasant part of the day. But then when you start beginning to approach 10 o'clock, starting to head towards noon, the sun climbs high in the sky, and it gets oppressively hot. Mm-hmm. Also, this is the time of day where you've kind of moved through your morning pattern of prayer and things like this, and you're kind of in this place where your day is less structured. Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of you might say there's a lack of direction. There's a lack of structure in your life. And this time of day is the time of day where you're becoming increasingly uncomfortable. Time seems to slow down. We have this kind of experience often within our days where there's a sense of restlessness and we're waiting. It just seems like the clock is going slower and slower. Then he constrains the monk to look constantly out the window, to walk outside the cell, that's their home, to gaze carefully at the sun to determine how far it stands from the 9th hour. So there's this constant waiting. What's going on? I want to move into the next stage where I'm doing something and I'm being unproductive at this particular time. And I'm restless. I'm moving apart. I'm looking out the window all
seems
the time.
unhappy with whatever is right before you. And look out the window because you're not happy with what's going on inside the cell. Look at the sun to see if the day is moving on because you're unhappy with the time of day it is. This idea of wanting to be elsewhere than the present moment and present place, right?
Yes, and then he continues on. Then, too, the Noonday demon instills in the heart of the monk a hatred for the place, a hatred for his very life, a hatred for manual labor. He leads him to reflect that charity has departed among the brethren and that there is no one to give encouragement. So let's think about this. This is really connected to what you're saying. A sense of discontent, restlessness.
Yeah.
There's nobody loves me. Nobody cares about me. You start to look at everything with sort of like a gray haze begins to descend upon all the people of your life, and you see all of their faults. And the picture that I get is often a picture that's described when people describe their experience of depression. It's almost as if all the colors have drained out of the world. Mm-hmm. Drained out of the world. He leads him to reflect that charity has departed among the brethren, that there is no one to give encouragement. So now there's no one there to help me. I'm all on my own. Should there be someone at this period who happens to offend him in some way or other, this too the demon uses to contribute further to this hatred. So again, there's this fixation on past wounds, faults that I've experienced or I have inflicted upon others. So our mind begins to fixate on those things. This demon drives him along to desire other sites where he can more easily procure life's necessities, more readily find work, and make a real success of himself. He goes on to suggest that after all, it is not the place that is the basis of pleasing the Lord. God is to be adored everywhere. And so he enjoins to these reflections the memory of his dear ones and his former way of life. He depicts life stretching out for a long period of time and brings before the mind's eye the toil of ascetic struggle. As the saying has it, leaves no leaf unturned to induce the monk to forsake his cell and drop out of the fight. So what's this description here? It's a sense of discontent.
I think there's two elements here. There's a deep discontent with everything. It's sort of the opposite of looking at everything through rose-colored glasses. So unhappy with where he's at, with who he's with what he's doing, with his life, and so on. This idea, if could have other things that would make him happier or have more joy. But what goes with that, I think, is what it does is it destroys a determination, a resolve to have a kind of constancy in one's life.
Yes.
Right? This kind of negativity or deep discontent with the present moment and present conditions and present life, what it does is in some sense destroys any kind of project or training you're engaged in. And so you would kind of flip back and forth, because I mean, think about that description. If you think about in our own lives, when we're in this mood, if you're in a different situation, you wouldn't be happy, right? It's not really the situation, right? It's within you. And what it does, I think it produces the incapacity for a kind of long obedience, a long training, right?
Yeah, I mean, we think this word, the noonday demon, is a little alien and a little foreign, right? But, we could translate the midday demon, right? And actually, that connects really to a concept or an idea that is really prevalent in our day, which is the midlife crisis. What he's describing here is the same kind of experience, a sense of, there's nothing has any joy for me. If I would just sort of I don't like where I'm at. I can't really love the people that are around me. Every sort of the joy of life gets sucked out. If I can just sort of give myself something or distract myself in some way or reset my life in some way, then I would be happy, right? That experience of the midlife crisis, which we all know is not something experienced in midlife.
For me, it's more theoretical. You're in your midlife.
Right.
I'll trust you on this one.
But seriously, like there's a sense in which the midday trial and the midlife crisis really express this similar experience, this sense of restlessness and discontent and despondency and some depression.
Yeah, like what's it all for? What's going on? And not just as an intellectual question, but this like feeling deep in your gut, right? Things just come and go. Nothing seems satisfying. When you're young, you've got all these projects and all these goals, and when you're, in your midlife, you're like, okay, what's this for? And you mentioned in our prep, it reminds you of Ecclesiastes with King Solomon, kind of saying, what is this all for? It all just passes. It's all pointless, and just kind of staying mired in that.
Right. So this is I think what happens with us. I think for Evagrius anyway, he doesn't own a lot of things. He's in his little hut, in the desert, and so there's not much to distract him. There's the window. He can go to the window and he can look out there, right? And he can be thinking or imagining life would be better here, or life was better then. That kind of restlessness, that kind of distraction is about all he's got. Now, in our 21st century, we have all kinds of distractions.
Yeah.
So this is typically where we go, right? So we get there's this kind of sense of restlessness that we experience. I don't know what my life's about. I don't know where I'm going. So what am I going to do to make me feel better? And we tend to have our sort of chosen go-tos to deal with this experience of restlessness, whether it's the Facebook feed that we're always on doing this, distracting ourselves in that way, whether it's, watching the 24/7 newsreel of infotainment, right? This is like we're going to sit down and we're going to watch what's going wrong with the world.
Get my
5
dose
hours
of fear and anger to feel better for the day.
Right. Or some of us, it's buying things, that experience, that sort of that feeling that we get when, I purchased something, and then you have sort of like the shopaholic kind of thing that happens. For many of us, it's celebrity gossip. I mean, there's all kinds, or football. I mean, I'm sorry, no offense, but a sense of distracting ourselves with things that
We live in Ohio, which is why Wes had to say, sorry, no offense about the football comment.
we got big football fans around here, but I do have to say there's a sense in which if we can engage ourselves, our minds with largely trivial things that can distract us from this general sense of, I don't really know where my life is going. I've kind of lost joy in life. And there's enormous amounts of distraction that just sort of kind of keeps us going throughout this experience of Acedia.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, it tends to feed Acedia, make it worse.
Yeah, and I think we can get at that broader sort of macro view of Acedia taking over one's life by do a sort of microcosmic look at it. We talked about, sometimes you're just so happy you have a day where there's nothing planned, and you just spend your day indulging whatever little whim you have that day. And I don't know about you, but for me, a day like that is usually, but in the day, I'm like an anxious mess. Like that's, it sounds great at the beginning of the day, but just jumping from this thing to that thing, scrolling through Facebook, watching Netflix. At the end of the day, it doesn't feel great. It doesn't feel like a good day where you got stuff done, you're working on some project. And so those days that sort of where we give in to every little whim and every little pleasure that leads to that kind of misery, if you think about a day like that, extend it out.
Over
and you're
time,
kind of stuck like that, and you're walking through all your days like that, even as you go to work or even as you raise your kids. And so it's an especially sort of miserable passion, right? Where like sadness last week has this like acute intensity. Acedia has this ability to just drag everything.
It just
down,
drains the life out of you.
and where sadness can be like chased away with a happy event, Acedia. You learn in some sense this capacity to see the negative in everything. So a happy event or this or that, or even one day of doing things that might pull you out, it's not enough.
Yes.
It's this sort of deep illness.
Yes. And it tends to suck the joy and the life out of you. You find yourself largely apathetic, kind of complaining, tired, the sense of, that kind of burden that you have to kind of carry. And what we do in response is distract ourselves some more, right? And it's this kind of endless cycle that we end up getting into. And to be honest, it can sort of over enough period of time, it shapes us so much that we can enter into deep forms of depression.
Yes. Vagarius thinks this is a very, very, very destructive passion. Right? It can destroy your joy. It can keep you away from engaging in any kind of spiritual disciplines whatsoever, because when you're in this state, you're always looking for something that's immediately pleasurable. Things that require patience are the last thing you will do when you're in a state of acedia.
Yeah.
And let's be honest with you, a life of prayer requires patience. The payoff is not at all immediate. The life of repentance requires patience. And so it can wreck us seeking a life of union with Jesus Christ. Not that it can separate you from Christ, but fully taking hold of that life and letting its blessings come through within your heart. It's certainly something that chases us away from that.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit more about the noonday demon, where he gets this term, the noonday demon. And obviously, as we said, it relates to his experience because it tends to be in that period of the day, in his context, where this sort of feeling sets in, this feeling of restlessness, the oppressive heat. But he's actually referencing scripture. Psalm 91, and I'm gonna go ahead and read verses 1 through 6, and then maybe we can kind of talk a little bit about this. So, Psalm 91, 1 through 6. You who live in the shelter of the Most High, who abide in the shadow of the Almighty, will say to the Lord, my refuge and my fortress, my God in whom I trust. For he will deliver you from the snare of the fowler and from the deadly pestilence. He will cover you with his pinions, and under his wings you will find refuge. His faithfulness is a shield and buckler. You will not fear the terror of the night, or the arrow that flies by day, or the pestilence that stalks in darkness, or the destruction or demon that wastes at noonday. So that's where he gets the image of the demon that wastes at noonday there. And he's seeing it in the context of all of these attacks we're suffering, pestilence, fear, all of these threats to our spiritual well-being. And one of them is this noonday demon.
Yeah, so it's interesting to me. My first reaction to Psalm 91 like that is to think of King David in like external foes, right? That these are just literal descriptions of illness and actual enemies, people coming to kill you. But Evagrius sees in this like our internal foes, right? The passions. And that this vivid language of the Psalms has very much to do with the life of, say, temptation, the life of asceticism or of training, and that it's playing out on that level. It's not simply about my relationship to others, but it's about my own relationship to my heart, my own relationship to the Lord, and it's playing out in this way. And he sees things like Acedia, this sort of listlessness or despondency as this enemy, this really dangerous enemy, and that running to the Lord is a shelter from that enemy. Right?
So maybe we could take just a few minutes, and I don't know if we have any. I think we might have a few words to share about this. I mean, Evagrius calls this the demon of noonday, and he understands it as a spiritual enemy, a spiritual power. That afflicts us in this way. And today, when we tend to use the language of demon or spiritual attack or all this kind of stuff, we tend, again, to see it kind of external. Like there's just this external, weird, strange poltergeist force out there that's going to attack me. But for Evagrius, all the demons that he names are all in relationship. They're all connected with specific vices that we experience internally. So there is the demon of sadness. There is the demon of gluttony. There is the demon of, vainglory or anger, and the demon of acedia. And so what would we say about how Evagrius might, challenge or question the way that we look at spiritual warfare versus the way that he does?
So I think in our world, we tend to think there's this sort of moral side of our life where we're trying to be good people. And then there's this weird exotic stuff called spiritual warfare, which is like when things move in your house and nobody touched them, or you hear voices in
Get
your
out the
house,
cross
right?
and the holy water.
Right.
Yeah.
But for him, those aren't divided, right? The struggle for virtue, the struggle to be moral, which isn't really to be moral, it's actually the struggle to embrace Christ's own life. That is spiritual warfare, right? Demonic attack is less often things being thrown across your room or hearing voices, and more often it's you're wrestling with anger, you're wrestling with sadness or with greed and so forth, and it's there in temptation. I mean, think about Christ's face to face with Satan. Yeah, you've got this imagery of him talking to somebody outside of himself, but really you've got Christ who is exhausted and hungry, and he's being tempted with things to satisfy his hunger, things that will make his path less difficult without a cross at the end, and so forth. And so temptation and these kinds of things that we've been talking about are really the thick terrain of spiritual warfare for the ancient Christians.
Yes, I'd like to add a little bit to that. I think today, what's happened today is that we've divided parts of our life up from one another. We've got the moral or the ethical part of our life, which is basically do the right thing, right? There's right and wrong. We connect that with laws of the land, all that kind of stuff, right? Then there's the psychological part of us, right? Which has to do with, again, we get real complicated about it, but you talk about the subconscious mind, the conscious mind, and there's psychological ailments and psychological therapy and psychological cures, right? So there's the moral, there's the psychological, and then over here's the spiritual. And the spiritual has to do with God and heaven and the demons and hell and all that kind of stuff. And for us, we tend to assume today that all these things are divided up, that somehow there's this reality, and then there's this reality, and there's this reality, and they're not connected at all. But for Evagrius, it's all intertwined. The spiritual, the psychological, the ethical, it all has its unity in Jesus Christ and Christ's relationship to the soul. So there is the more talking about right and wrong only makes sense in relationship to who God is and who we are in relationship to God. Same with the psychological part of us. I mean, I've mentioned this before. The word that we derive psychology from is the Greek word soul. I mean, psychology is the study of the soul. It is the and we've noticed that Evagrius has done psychological study. That's what he's doing here with all this talk about restlessness, and it's psychological study, but it's also spiritual. So the point is that when Evagrius talks about the attack of the noonday demon, we ought not to just all of a sudden go to some poltergeist horror movie scenario. What we need to be thinking about is that we're talking about a psychological issue, we're talking about a moral issue, and we're talking about a spiritual issue all at once.
Yeah.
And they ought not to be pulled asunder from one another.
Exactly. So it's both not talking about a poltergeist, but also when you say it's psychological, we don't mean he's simply trying to attend to making you, quote unquote, feel better.
Right.
The issue here is the soul's union with Jesus Christ, something that pulls it away from that. So any reference to joy or so forth is always around that union with Christ. And so it's not, and any misery that he's diagnosing is not simply about immediate feeling so much as that distance that grows up.
That's right. And just to make a point here that I think can really help too, is typically when psychologists work with us in therapy, they want to say they're trying to get us back onto a path of wellness, right? That's their job. I'm going to try to get you well. Okay. Evagrius agrees. But Evagrius is not going to equate wellness with what's most common or normal. Wellness is Christ.
Yes.
So when he is trying to get us back onto the path of wellness, he's working like a psychologist. He's saying, what are the symptoms? What are the problems? Let's work toward healing, which is what a psychologist would do. The difference is for him, wholeness and wellness is union with Christ. And so he's going beyond what a present-day psychologist would do, and he's actually saying it's something greater and deeper than we normally experience in what we call normal or healthy. Normal or healthy person is actually someone who's suffering from the passions.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Yeah, and Evagrius can't imagine a well-functioning soul that's not married to Christ. Right. The soul does not accidentally or it just happenstance have a union with Jesus Christ, and that brings it joy. The soul is created from this from the beginning. Remember, it's not plan B, it's plan A. We are created to be temples housing Christ's presence within us. Our soul was created to be Christ's spouse. And so he can't even imagine what a well-functioning soul would be apart from that. So
that to me is a really important observation, because what it does then is says, for example, this experience of what we might call frustrated restlessness, the Acedia. If we find ourselves constantly flipping through Facebook feed or constantly needing to distract ourselves, or this sense of all the joy has sort of like evacuated out of my life, has sort of been poured out of my life, and I find myself in some kind of version of a midlife crisis or whatever, that is essentially its deepest dimension is a spiritual dimension. It's got psychological reality to it too as well, and moral reality too. But so we ought to understand ourselves. If we're in this stage or we're experiencing this in life, we ought to understand it as having a spiritual root.
Yes. Now I want to back up real quick and say, like, if you're suffering from severe depression, we are not saying just go pray and don't go seek help. We're not saying that at all. Please don't hear that from us. I just wanted to throw that out there. Psychologists, psychiatrists, counselors can certainly help with that, but so can pastors and a prayer discipline as well. But again, we don't want anybody to hear in this if you're suffering from some kind of severe depression that you should just go into your room and pray rather than seek out help. I just wanted to get
help
that out
in
there.
many different, in all of its different forms. Yeah, yeah. So to focus here again on Psalm 91, there's this constant attacks that he's describing: the snare of the fowler, the deadly pestilence. There is the arrows that fly by day, the pestilence that stalks in darkness, the demon of noonday. We're all being attacked by this. And in this description of the psalm, he says, it's the person who finds shelter in the Most High, who abides in the shadow of the Almighty, who is able to experience refuge from this. So I think when we begin to look at this, where do we want to encourage people who are experiencing this? All of us, in some sense, will probably experience acedia in some form. Where do we go? I mean, here he talks about dwelling in the refuge of the Most High, in the shelter of the Almighty. How do we want to? It's pointing to some kind of hope or some kind of sustenance or support. Where would we go? Where would we go with that?
To me, like when I hear that language about the shelter of the Most High or abiding with the Almighty, I mean, to me, that's temple language, right? That's the temple, and this idea that it's in the temple that you are at one with Christ, and you have that kind of joy that can chase this away. For me, when I think about acedia, and I have gone through that in my life, and it just seems like such a massive storm. Where this takes me to is Noah's flood. I'll try to set this up carefully to make this clear, but I'm high on cold meds, so I'm not sure, so help me out here. Noah's flood is also a story about a temple. The temple has those three sections in it, and Noah's Ark, has three floors, and each floor is precisely 3 times the area of Moses' tabernacle. So we're playing with the three. We're playing, and it's
Symbolically
representing the temple. It's also connected to creation, the idea that the original creation was a massive temple. But anyway, so what you have here is essentially you've got this storm of chaos that comes in that covers the whole. It's global. It covers everything.
Yeah.
There's wind, there's rain, and it snuffs out all of life. But in this little temple, you've got, which is almost nothing when you think about like a global flood. It's tossed about, but in that little temple, when you think temple, you think prayer discipline. You think repentance and so forth. That little temple tossed about, in that, there's a whole a world in there that can come forth. And so what I think about is the fact that, we like to talk about how today we are the temple of Jesus Christ, but can think about it is we are that ark, or our prayer discipline can be that ark where it's just this little thing, this little space in your house, this little corner you have carved out, or this little time during the day that you make sure you keep your prayer discipline going.
Yes.
This little space in your heart. Now, there might be this sort of storm of despondency and negative emotions everywhere. And that little space in your home or that little time in your heart that you carve out might seem like nothing to keep that going, to keep reading the Psalms, to keep praying and so forth. But what it is there's a world that will come pouring forth when that storm subsides. It's that little temple that keeps the world intact. And again, it might seem like nothing against the force of the swirl of all these negative thoughts and the force of it, but it carries a whole world inside of it. And that little discipline, just keeping that little discipline going, might someday rest on a mountain, and all this life will pour forth.
Yeah, I think the image that you're drawing, first of all, it would be wonderful to spend more time actually getting specific into the scriptures about the connections and all that. We can't do that today.
Right.
But there are certain things that it speaks to me that I'd like to share. One is that Noah has been commanded, and he's able to survive the storm, which blots out all breath. It's this idea that basically kills the earth, right? He's able to survive that because he's obedient. And this practice that we're talking about is precisely in the experience of acedia, where we're restless. We don't really have a desire to pray. We don't see any value in it. We don't see any value in doing these things. That obedience is so important. Obedience is required because there's going to be acedia precisely sucks your energy, your desire, so if your spiritual life, if what sustains it is your feelings, your passion, your love for Jesus, that will dry up at times. That will be wiped out. the life will be stolen from you. And it's the obedience that's going to allow you to continue. So I think that that's one thing about that story that I would want to highlight.
It's a small disciplined obedience, right? So against a global flood, a global storm,
Yes.
building this boat is kind of a small obedience.
That's right.
But it's disciplined. It takes him many years to build it.
That's right.
And that's this idea of like emotions are great. It's good to feel passionate about your love for Jesus Christ, but there will be times when Acedia attacks and that goes away. What you'll want to rely on is some small obedience.
Yes.
Some small discipline that by force of habit keeps it going.
Yes.
And in that massive storm of Acedia, which Evagrius says is the most oppressive passion, that will carry your life with
Yes.
it. So again, I mean, I like to think about this idea that we as temples are like, we are like Noah's Ark, like walking through a world of chaos. And some of
That's
that
right.
chaos is in my own mind
Nice.
and in my own emotions.
That's right.
But this little discipline makes us this little boat that carries Christ's presence and can ferry us to the other side of these massive storms.
That's right.
By not simply depending on passion and emotion, but actually, even if it's small, even if you're just faithful in one little thing, Christ says, you'll be made faithful in many. But to take the time to build at least that small discipline
That's
that
right.
happens day in, day out, in spite of your feelings.
The other thing I'd like to point out about the story as well that I think is instructive is that according to the story, I mean, Noah, is not called in faithfulness to make the waters subside. And I think that this is one thing that really afflicts people who experience acedia, and even its darkest forms, or its which is depression. From the people that I know that have gone through this experience, one of the greatest things that they're burdened with is, why can't I make myself feel better? Why can't I make this go away? Not only do they experience the depression, but they, on top of that, is this guilt and this anxiety that if I was right, I could fix this. And there's this kind of, we get caught up in this sort of endless loop of I feel bad and I feel bad that I feel bad and I can't fix it.
Yeah, you're supposed to be able to regulate your own affect. We talked about that last time.
That's
right?
exactly right. But what's interesting about, I think, about the story about the story of the flood is that Noah is not called upon to make the water subside. He's called upon to endure, to maintain, like you said, that small space of life until the waters pass. And we don't know when that's going to be. In fact, you continue the story. I mean, Noah sort of has to continue to wait and see, are the waters subsiding yet in the form of the dove? And it doesn't happen, right? It doesn't happen first. And he sends
Right.
it out again. It doesn't happen. So there's a sense in which there's this patient waiting, there's this obedience, there's this small space. And I would encourage the language here of shelter of the Most High is that word literally means sort of like a secret place or hiding place. And that prayer discipline that we have, encouraged like late at night or early in the morning, you have your own space, you have your own time. It may be 10 minutes during the day, but in that small space you have, you cultivate patient waiting and expectation.
Yeah, a couple of things I want to say about that is, right. So it's not Noah's job to make the waters go down. He waits patiently, he endures. But also Evagrius' language of this as a demon, right? Acedia is not something, so to speak, you're at fault for, right? It's an attack.
That's right.
It's an attack to pull you away from Jesus Christ.
That's right.
And it's actually God's job to defeat the demons, right?
That's right.
So the story of Noah is also intimately attached to the Exodus story, right? The people pass through the waters, and there's 40 years. Instead of 40 days of flood, it's 40 years. But when they come upon the waters in the Exodus story that symbolize the chaos and the storm and so forth, they're told, be still, and the Lord will fight for you. And what they're supposed to do is simply bravely and with faith march through those waters, right?
Yeah, and Evagrius is actually going to go into some depth here about some specific ways to try to help us. Interestingly enough, it's gonna connect with the story of Noah here. But what's interesting about it is he spends more time trying to help us with this than any of the other passages we've seen so far. There's a real sense in which he's invested in helping us, because it tends to be something we suffer from for a longer period of time. It's more complicated. That he gives us some advice. So he says, when we meet with the demon of Acedia, then is the time with tears to divide our soul in two. One part is to encourage, the other is to be encouraged. Thus we are to sow seeds of a firm hope in ourselves, while we sing with the holy David, "Why are you filled with sadness, my soul? Why are you distraught? Trust in God, for I shall give praise to him. He it is who saves me, the light of my eyes and my God." So what's he describing there? I think it's a perfect description of what could happen in that arc, in that time of prayer.
I like the idea of dividing your soul, because on the one hand, your soul, when you're stuck in Acedia, has embraced the demonic story, so to speak.
Yes.
And so Evagrius says, divide it and talk back.
Yes.
Right? If there's one portion of your soul that's utterly convinced it's all pointless and meaningless and nothing is of any value, divide your soul and let another part of you speak with the scriptures back to it.
Yes.
And have faith in the Lord and push back. And
Yeah.
I would say sometimes it's even worth writing these things down,
Yes.
because inside your head they just swirl with no friction. You can
Yes.
write them down, and then you can write back against them. You can write out a psalm.
That's right.
Pray a psalm.
And to use the image of the flood, it's not like soon as we say those words, all of a sudden the waters are going to subside and we're going to feel better. It's not that, because oftentimes those feelings will continue, right?
right.
But what we're talking about is a patience and an obedience and a faithfulness. It's interesting here when what he uses, what he quotes, he says, "He it is who saves me." Okay, where is it? Thus we are to sow the seeds of a firm hope. The hope, there's a sense of that firm hope that the waters will pass.
Yes.
So in the meantime, it's not like I'm doing this so that I'll feel better, right? We may continue to feel those that acedia, that sense of lifelessness, of that restlessness, of that hopelessness, but we keep talking to ourselves. We keep encouraging ourselves by reading the Psalms, by prayer. Why are you so downcast, my soul? Why are you so downcast? Trust in the Lord. And even if that trust doesn't come, we keep telling ourselves.
It's worth wrestling with those own negative thoughts you have, right? Enter into a fight with them. Even if you can't beat them right now, it's worth fighting them. I think sometimes it's easy to just give in and let them fly.
Yes.
But what he's saying is take the time to wrestle them. Like, talk back, push back. Don't just embrace them.
That's right.
Hate the eight. Like,
Yes.
Push back and run towards the Lord.
Yes. And then he continues on. He says, "The time of temptation is not the time to leave one's cell, devising plausible pretexts. Rather, stand there firmly and be patient. Bravely take all that the demon brings upon you, but above all, face up to the demon of Acedia, who is the most grievous of all, and who on this account will effect the greatest purification of the soul. Indeed, to flee and to shun such conflicts schools the spirit in awkwardness, cowardice, and fear." So what he's saying there is precisely when you're tempted to distract yourself, or I'm going to change this about my life, or I'm going to, whatever it is, I need a new spouse, a new job, a new whatever, right? That sense of fleeing to some other circumstance, in his image, flee one's own self, flee one's own situation. He says precisely there, stand firm, do not run toward those pretexts or those imagined solutions, but turn towards the demon of Acedia, stand your ground with Acedia. And he says, precisely because it's so difficult, this journey, and to me this brings hope and encouragement, this fight that we will have with Acedia will produce the most purification of the soul.
Yes.
It will heal us, strengthen us more than our attacks with our struggles with anger or gluttony or lust.
Right. I mean, to give hope to some of you out there, if you're struggling with Acedia, I'm going to go another place where Evagrius can help you see if you're suffering from this. There can be great hope, because pushing through this or trusting in the Lord to get you through this brings unique blessing. He writes in chapter 12 of the Practicus, Well, when he diagnoses some of the other passions, he talks about like, you beat anger, then pride comes right behind and so forth. But with this one, he says, no other demon follows close upon the heels of this one when he is defeated. So when you defeat Acedia, usually there's not another trick of the devil behind that, right? But only a state of deep peace and inexpressible joy arises out of this struggle. So it is an especially difficult passion to wrestle with. But to wrestle with it, to keep that little discipline all the way through, to come through the other side, there is great abundance on the other side of this in a way that, is even more so than with like anger or greed or so forth, right? It is difficult and it's grievous, but it has great promise to enter into your wrestling match with this.
So I want to say this also about, we're talking about spiritual warfare here. And the way that Evagrius approaches these things, what he provides for us in terms of how we ought to respond when we are attacked spiritually by, for example, the demon of Acedia, are things like, just to highlight, obedience. So what that is a word we might use is, obedience is pretty much two things. It's faith and commitment combined together. So there's a sense of we're going to trust even though we don't feel this way, right? Obedience involves, even though I don't necessarily understand or grasp how all this is going to work out, I am going to continue. I'm going to trust and obey in that sense. Commitment and patience follow through day after day after day. And there's a kind of humility of waiting in expectation for the waters to subside. And those are really, this isn't like really glamorous.
No.
This isn't, when we think about spiritual warfare stuff, we tend to get these really graphic images in our mind and, these really dramatic images. But what he's really pointing to is obedience, faithfulness, prayer, encouragement, commitment, hope, a firm hope. I don't know if you want to add anything.
And there's
to that.
tremendous fruit to be won from that. We tend to think of freedom in our world, in our context here in America, as getting to do whatever you want whenever you want. But that can actually lead to acedia, where you're giving into every little pleasure.
Yeah.
And one of the things we're saying here is if you actually stick to a discipline, a freedom can open up that's unlike freedom you could have where you just become a victim to your own passions, a victim to your own pleasures and desires. And that's what acedia feeds on. You think about, great basketball players. They are more free on a basketball court to do things than I am because they worked hard. They trained. That's asceticism. That's training. The other thing is what came to my mind as you're describing it is sticking to it. It's not glamorous. It's hard. But the great fruit, I was actually thinking of reading Lord of the Rings. But you get deep into it, and then Sam and Frodo, sorry for those of you who don't know Lord of the Rings, they're going through Mordor. And I don't know if you remember when you read that part, whenever the story goes back to their story, because it goes from the various characters, you're like, oh my gosh, they're still going through Mordor. And it's just painful to read it.
Grueling, yeah.
It is utterly grueling. But when they finally get to Mount Doom and they destroy the ring, it's so amazing. But it wouldn't have been without passing through that grueling part of the story.
That's right.
And it's actually born of the discipline won through those difficult times like that. So...
Yeah, and to connect that again with what you were saying about our culture, commitment is not something that's really prized in our culture. We tend to think that there should be a fairly easy fix for anything, and that promotes and perpetuates acedia, because if we don't have a quick fix, then we think there's something wrong with me.
Right.
And people, especially people who suffer or struggle in various degrees of depression, this is one of the most terrible forms of it, because what happens is it doesn't pass, and doesn't pass soon, and it seems like everything else in life to us is so quick and so easy. And this creates a kind of absolute despair. But I think it's important to remember that there's so much in real life, not the kind of artificial cultural life that we've created, but real life, it's painstaking, it's long, it takes time. Any spiritual fruit takes time.
Mm-hmm.
Anything of genuine substance takes time. And any struggle that is a real struggle, that's really going to produce strength of spirit, that's really going to purify us, it's going to be a long struggle.
Yeah.
And if we can embrace that, I mean, in the sense of not why isn't this working for me, but recognize that it may be, and again, there's so much wisdom here. Like the stuff that we talk about with prayer as being liberating, as freedom, that only happens over years and years and years and years. You don't pray for a week and all of a sudden it's like, oh, you know, everything's all right. I've got this wonderful, close relationship with Christ. It is a lifelong, long, enduring
I think we
journey.
can make two mistakes. One, we want the quick payoff, and two, we try to make it heroic. So what we do is we pray for an hour for 2 or 3 days, and then it's like nothing's coming of it.
Yes.
So we get bored. Don't make it heroic. It can be a small obedience to start with. The point
right.
is to stick with it. Faith the size of a mustard seed, right?
Yes.
Through a kind of long obedience can produce this. So don't give in to this idea, I'm going to go to my prayer closet and I'm just going to pray it all away in a few days by praying for hours. No, it's okay. Start small.
Yep.
It just takes a little discipline.
Yep.
The Lord will meet that and come running to you the second you turn. But the point is to stay turned towards Him.
Yeah, and the beauty of the image that you introduced to us with Noah and his flood is Noah's job is to continue to nourish and sustain the small amount of life inside that little tabernacle.
Yeah, not heroic at all.
In that little sort of tabernacle of life, everything else has died, and the little form of life that's still there, it will repopulate the world. There will be a new world that comes from that. His job isn't to create that new world. His job is merely to nourish and sustain that little bit of life that's left, and that's really until the storm passes. That's our job. That's our job.
Just a little mustard seed faith each day, and the new world was born from that. It's not heroic. Don't hear you have to do these great acts of struggle. It's these small, persistent, disciplined acts.
And interestingly enough, the scriptures account this passage of Noah, what he goes through as a time. It's a purification. He's purifying the world. Here we are purifying our soul, because as there's all this death that's happening, all this, in some ways, even though it's a demon of the enemy that's attacking us, the Lord can use that so that we die to those passions and we learn to live with a rootedness in Christ, and that new life can come from that over the time as the waters begin to die down. And until then, hope, firm hope, endurance, obedience, time of life.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
All right.
Just, a word of encouragement. We don't mean to be all dark and despondent here, but this is real stuff. This is real life stuff.
Yeah.
And to me, this has been very helpful to me in my own life and in my own walk, and the people that I'm connected to, the people that I love, who also go through these things. So we know that it's heavy stuff, but we hope that it's helpful to you, and that it means something to you. We believe it does. Yeah.
I'm done.
You're done? Pray for Ethan as he endures his cold and his stressful week. Keep him in your prayers, and we will be praying for you as well. May the peace of Christ reign in your heart as we endure all forms of trial.
Yes.
Peace
Thanks for joining us.
Peace of Christ.